The millionaire was surprised when the street boy said he knew how to save his sick dog. The best veterinarians had tried everything, but nothing worked. Buddy, his faithful 8-year-old Jack Russell Terrier, had only a few weeks to live. The diagnosis was inconclusive, but the symptoms only worsened each day. The dog barely ate, no longer barked, and spent hours lying down without energy, staring at nothing with lusterless eyes. Richard, his owner, wiped away a stubborn tear that ran down his time-worn face. At 58, after amassing a considerable fortune through shrewd investments, he found himself completely powerless in the face of the situation. Not all the money in the world could help his only true companion. That's when he heard a thin, determined voice coming from the gates of his property. "Mister, I know how to save your dog." Richard looked up and saw a skinny boy, no more than 12 years old, clinging to the bars of the gate. He wore a worn-out Red Sox t-shirt, faded jean shorts, and flip-flops. "Go away, kid. I'm not in the mood for games," said Richard, turning his back. "His coat has lost its shine, he doesn't eat, lies around all day and breathes differently, right?" the boy insisted. Richard stopped. He turned slowly. "How do you know that?" "I saw you walking last week. And now I saw the vet in the white coat leaving. I know these signs. I can help." Something in the boy's determined gaze made Richard hesitate. Perhaps it was just desperation, or perhaps it was the fact that he had already consulted the best specialists in the country without results. "What's your name?" he asked, approaching the gate again. Jake Sullivan. But everyone calls me Jake." Richard examined the boy for a few seconds. He was probably the son of a local worker, or perhaps a resident of one of the simpler neighborhoods in the vicinity. What could he know that veterinarians with decades of experience didn't know? "And how do you plan to help my dog, Jake?" The boy smiled, revealing a missing baby tooth. "Old man nobody taught me. He used to take care of animals in the park before he left." Old man nobody? A man who lived on the streets. He knew everything about animals, everything. He taught me a lot before he left. Richard noticed the boy's hesitation when speaking about this old man nobody. The man had probably passed away, and the boy didn't want to talk about it. For a moment, Richard saw himself reflected in that boy in the way he averted his gaze when mentioning the absence of someone important. "Look, kid, I appreciate your concern, but I don't think—" A weak bark came from inside the house, followed by a painful whimper that broke Richard's heart. Buddy was suffering, and he knew it. "Please, mister, let me try. If it doesn't work, I'll leave and never come back." Richard looked at the mansion where he lived alone, except for 2 employees who only came during the day. Mrs. Jenkins, the housekeeper, and Frank, responsible for maintaining the property and garden. Neither of them would be there at that moment. "All right, you can come in, but just for today, and don't touch anything besides the dog, understood?" The smile that spread across the boy's face lit up his features in a way that disturbed Richard. How long had it been since he himself had smiled like that? Perhaps since before that fateful day, 8 years ago. Richard opened the gate, and the boy entered, walking beside him through the well-maintained gardens of the mansion. The house was an imposing neoclassical construction with white columns and large windows, typical of the old residences in the New England area. The place exuded loneliness despite all its beauty. Upon entering the house, the boy whistled softly, impressed with the luxury around him, but soon his gaze fixed on the small dog curled up on a cushion in the corner of the living room. Buddy slightly raised his head, as if sensing the visitor's presence. "May I?" asked Jake, pointing to the dog. Richard nodded, still suspicious. The boy approached slowly and knelt at a safe distance from the animal. He didn't try to touch him immediately. Instead, he began to speak in a low, melodious voice. "Hey, buddy, how are you? I'm Jake. I came to visit you today." To Richard's surprise, Buddy moved his tail slightly. It was an almost imperceptible movement, but for someone who knew the dog, it represented an interest he hadn't shown in days. "Can I come closer?" the boy continued, talking to the dog, as if asking permission. Buddy kept his eyes fixed on the boy, and Jake approached slowly, always talking. When he was a few inches away, he extended his hand, but not to pet the dog. Instead, he left his hand suspended in the air, allowing Buddy to sniff it if he wanted. That's how Old Man Nobody taught me. We don't invade their space. We ask permission, explained the boy, keeping his eyes on the dog. After a few seconds, Buddy slightly stretched his muzzle and sniffed the boy's hand. Jake smiled. Can I touch him now? Richard, fascinated with the boy's approach, just nodded. Jake then gently placed his hand under Buddy's chin, giving him a light massage. The dog closed his eyes. His belly is swollen, observed the boy, and his breathing is difficult. How long has he been like this? It started about 2 weeks ago, but it's gotten worse in the last few days. And what does he eat? The best quality dog food, imported. Jake frowned. Just dog food, no real food. The veterinarians always recommended dog food to maintain a balanced diet, replied Richard, slightly irritated by the questioning. Old Man Nobody used to say that animals need living food, food that has energy. Living food? Richard almost laughed. And what would that be? Fresh things, raw vegetables, fruits, herbs, things that still have the strength of nature. Richard shook his head. That sounded like cheap mysticism. But something in the way Buddy responded to the boy's touch intrigued him. And you think this will cure my dog? I don't know if it will cure him, but it will help. Buddy needs many things. Right food is just one of them. How do you know his name? It's on the collar, Jake pointed with a mischievous smile. Richard felt foolish. Of course it was on the collar. What else do you think he needs? Exercise, affection, purpose. Purpose? He's a dog. Everyone needs purpose, mister. Even dogs. They like to feel useful, to have missions. Buddy seems like a smart dog. He must be sad inside. Richard observed the boy with growing interest. How could an ordinary child raised on the streets, from what it seemed, speak with such conviction about something so philosophical? And how do you suggest giving purpose to a sick dog? Can I come tomorrow? I'll bring some things that might help. Richard hesitated. Allowing that boy to return meant opening his home, his private life. He hadn't done that in years. Please, mister, I promise I'll help Buddy. I just need a chance. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Richard looked at Buddy, who for the first time in days seemed more alert, with his eyes following the boy's movements. What did he have to lose? All right, you can come back tomorrow, but it has to be after 3 in the afternoon, when Mrs. Jenkins has already gone home. Why? Doesn't she like children? Let's just say she's quite protective of me and doesn't approve of unexpected visitors. I understand. The boy smiled with complicity. It'll be our secret then. Before leaving, Jake asked to see the kitchen. Richard took him there, observing how the boy opened cabinets and inspected the pantry with a disconcerting familiarity. There's not much real food here, commented the boy. I don't cook. Mrs. Jenkins prepares my meals and leaves them in the refrigerator. And do you like what she makes? The question caught Richard by surprise. How long had it been since he'd thought about liking or not liking something? He simply ate what was necessary to survive, without paying much attention to taste. It's adequate, he finally answered. Adequate isn't tasty. Jake closed the pantry door. Tomorrow I'll bring tasty things for Buddy, and maybe for you too. When the boy finally left, Richard returned to the living room and found Buddy sitting, watching the door through which Jake had exited. For an instant, he seemed to see a spark of life in the animal's eyes. What did you think of him, old friend? He asked, sitting next to the dog. Buddy turned to him and for the first time in many days licked his hand. The next day, Richard found himself looking at the clock several times. Frank noticed his restlessness while pruning the rose bushes in the garden. Something wrong, mister. Winters, you seem anxious today. It's nothing, Frank, just waiting for a consultant. Consultant. Frank raised his eyebrows. The boss rarely received visitors, much less consultants. For Buddy, I'm trying an alternative approach. Frank nodded, without asking more questions. In his 10 years working for Richard Winters, he had learned to respect the boss's privacy. Everyone in the area knew the story. The famous veterinarian who had abandoned a brilliant career after a personal tragedy, isolating himself in the family mansion in Massachusetts. People talked, of course, but Frank never listened to gossip. At 3:15 in the afternoon, after Mrs. Jenkins had said goodbye with her usual recommendations about dinner in the refrigerator, the doorbell rang. Frank was at the back of the garden and didn't hear it, so Richard went to answer it personally. Jake was there carrying a worn cloth bag and smiling as if this were the best part of his day. "Hi, Mr. Richard. I brought the things for Buddy." Richard couldn't help but notice how the boy already treated him with familiarity, using his name. It was strange but not unpleasant. "What did you bring there?" "A bunch of good stuff. Can I come in?" Richard led him to the kitchen, where Jake began to take various items from the bag. Some fresh vegetables, herbs that Richard didn't immediately recognize, 2 oranges, an apple, a jar with something that looked like honey, and a small glass vial with a dark liquid. "Where did you get all this?" asked Richard, concerned that the boy might have stolen the items. "Some things I got from our backyard. Others Mrs. Wilson from the market gave me in exchange for helping carry boxes." He pointed to the dark vial. "This is from Mr. Thompson, from the herbal pharmacy. He always gives me some when I bring things. Or to him." Richard examined the vial with suspicion. "And what's in here?" "Propolis with herbs. It's good for inflammation and for giving strength. Old man Nobody always used it on sick animals." "You intend to give this to Buddy? This could be dangerous for a dog." "Just a few drops diluted in water. Old man Nobody said the secret is the right dose, just like pharmacy medicine." Jake began to separate some of the vegetables and cut them into very small pieces. His hands were skilled for someone so young, moving with the precision of someone who was used to doing that. "Where's Buddy?" asked the boy while he worked. "In the living room. He's barely left that cushion since you were here yesterday." "Today, he'll leave it." Jake smiled with confidence. He prepared a mixture of chopped vegetables, added a little honey, and assembled a small portion in a bowl. Then he separated some leaves of an aromatic herb that Richard identified as mint. "Can we take this to him? And I need a bowl with warm water." Richard fulfilled the request, increasingly curious about the boy's methods. They returned together to the living room, where Buddy remained lying down but raised his head when he saw them. "Hi, Buddy. I brought some good things for you today," said Jake, sitting on the floor near the dog. To Richard's surprise, Buddy got up, albeit with difficulty, and approached the boy. Jake placed the bowl with the vegetable mixture on the floor, but Buddy only sniffed it and showed no interest in eating. "That's okay, you don't have to eat now, let's do something else first." Jake took the mint leaves, rubbed them between his fingers to release the aroma, and then gently passed them over Buddy's muzzle. The dog inhaled the scent and seemed more alert. "Mint awakens the senses," explained the boy. "Old man Nobody said that when the body is weak, we need to wake it up slowly, like waking up in the morning." Next, Jake wet his hands in the warm water and began to gently massage Buddy's body, paying special attention to the abdominal region. His fingers worked with gentleness, but also with surprising technique. "Where did you learn to do these massages?" asked Richard, watching fascinated. "Tardy, from Old Man Nobody. He had magic hands. He said he learned from the Native Americans up north where he was born. This massage helps detoxify the body and makes the blood circulate better." Buddy, who normally wouldn't tolerate being handled by strangers when he was sick, seemed completely surrendered to the boy's hands. At one point he even closed his eyes, as if enjoying the treatment. After about 20 minutes of massage, Jake again took the bowl with the vegetable mixture and offered it to Buddy. This time, the dog sniffed with more interest and, to Richard's astonishment, licked some of the mixture. "He ate," exclaimed Richard, unable to hide his surprise. "He hasn't eaten anything for almost 2 days. That's because now his body is asking for real food." Jake smiled. "Animals know what they need, but sometimes we don't give them options to choose." While Buddy slowly ate the mixture, Jake prepared water with a few drops of the dark liquid from the vial. "This will help with the inflammation he has in his belly," he explained, placing the water near the dog. "How do you know he has inflammation?" The veterinarians didn't reach a conclusive diagnosis. "By the way he breathes, by the swelling here in this part," Jake pointed to Buddy's abdomen, "and by the heat coming from his skin. The body speaks, Mr. Richard. We just need to know how to listen." There was something in the simplicity and conviction with which the boy spoke that left Richard without arguments. Despite all his scientific training, he couldn't deny that Buddy seemed to respond positively to the boy's care. "Can I come back tomorrow?" asked Jake when Buddy finished eating and lay down again, this time seeming more comfortable. "He'll need this treatment for a few days." "Yes, you can come back," Richard hesitated. "But won't your parents worry? You spend a lot of time away from home." A shadow crossed the boy's face. "My mom works all day as a housekeeper, only comes back at night. And my dad, he left when I was little." Richard felt a tightness in his chest. The boy lived practically alone during the day, just like him. "And don't you go to school?" "I go in the morning. I get out at noon. Then I'm around helping people, taking care of animals in the park, those kinds of things." "I see." Richard hesitated again, then added, "If you want, I can ask Mrs. Jenkins to prepare a snack for you tomorrow before she leaves." Jake's face lit up. "Really? That would be cool, but won't she think it's strange?" "I'll tell her it's for a nephew who's coming to visit. It won't exactly be a lie." Jake smiled with the corner of his mouth, clearly pleased with the idea of being considered a nephew. Before leaving, he still recommended, "Mr. Richard, try talking to Buddy tonight. Tell him stories. Talk about good things. Animals feel our energy, and that helps them get better too." When the boy left, Richard watched him walk down the driveway that led to the gate. Frank, who was sweeping fallen leaves near the entrance, looked surprised at the boy who was leaving the house. "Who was the child, Mr. Winters?" he asked, as soon as Jake was far enough away not to hear. "A friend of Buddy's," replied Richard, going back inside before Frank could ask more questions. That night, sitting next to his dog, Richard found himself following Jake's advice. He began to talk to Buddy, telling him about his day, about memories from when the dog was still a puppy. At one point he realized he was talking about Sarah, his late wife, something he hadn't done in years. "She would have loved you, you know? She always wanted to have a dog, but with our routine at the clinic it never seemed to be the right time." A tear ran down Richard's face as long-suppressed memories resurfaced. Buddy, as if sensing his owner's emotion, got up with effort and placed his head on his lap. Richard stroked the dog's ears, grateful for the silent companionship. In the days that followed, Jake appeared punctually at 3:15, always with his bag full of natural remedies and new ideas to help Buddy. The dog gradually improved. He ate with more appetite, began to move around the house, and even occasionally barked. On the fourth day, Jake brought a small rubber ball. "Today we'll start with light exercises. His body is less inflamed now, and he needs to strengthen his muscles." He taught Buddy to fetch the ball, first just a few meters away. The dog, although not yet at full energy, seemed genuinely interested in the game, especially when Jake rewarded him with small pieces of raw carrot, which Buddy now loved. Frank, who always found a pretext to be nearby when Jake arrived, observed the interaction with growing suspicion. After the boy left that day, he approached Richard. "Mr. Winters, may I ask a question?" His tone was respectful, but firm. "Of course, Frank. Do you know this boy? Do you know who his family is?" "His name is Jake. Why do you ask?" "With all due respect, sir, but this boy shows up every day, messes with your dog, comes in and out of the house. Don't you find that a bit imprudent?" Richard frowned. "Imprudent? Buddy is visibly improving under his care. What could be imprudent about that?" "I don't question the results, sir, but we don't know anything about this boy. He could be—" Frank hesitated. "Part of some scheme to observe the house. Get to know the routine." "A scheme?" Richard almost laughed. "Frank, he's just a child." "Children can also be used by people with bad intentions, sir, especially when it comes to someone like you, a well-known person of means." Richard was silent for a moment. He had never considered this possibility. Could Jake just be a piece in some elaborate plan? The idea seemed absurd, but Frank was not a man to make unfounded accusations. "I appreciate your concern, Frank, but I think you're exaggerating. Jake is just a lonely boy who likes animals, and I haven't been a public figure for years." "As you wish, sir. I just thought I should express my concern." When Frank walked away, Richard became thoughtful. The truth was that he knew very little about Jake. The boy talked about his mother, about this old man nobody who had taught him about animals, but never went into details about his life. Richard decided that the next day he would try to find out more. The following afternoon, Mrs. Jenkins prepared a special snack before leaving, following Richard's instructions about the nephew who would be visiting him. She arranged a tray with sandwiches, carrot cake, and orange juice, clearly pleased that her boss was finally receiving a family member. "I'm glad you're having visitors, Mr. Winters," she commented as she finished setting the table. "It's good to have family around." Richard just nodded without correcting Mrs. Jenkins' assumption. Technically, Jake wasn't his nephew, but in the last few weeks the boy had brought more life to his house than any family visit could have done. When Jake arrived, his eyes widened at seeing the table set on the porch. "All this is for us?" "Mrs. Jenkins likes to go overboard," replied Richard with a half-smile. "Shall we eat a bit before taking care of Buddy today?" The boy hesitated only for a second before pulling up a chair and sitting down somewhat awkwardly. He was probably not used to formal meals. Richard noticed how he observed the different utensils with uncertainty. "You can use your hands for the sandwich," he said gently. Jake smiled, grateful, and took a sandwich, biting into it with evident pleasure. "It's really good. Mrs. Jenkins cooks too well." "Yes, she's an excellent cook," agreed Richard, serving himself some juice. "Jake, you never really told me about this old man nobody who taught you about animals. Who was he?" The boy chewed slowly, as if pondering what to say. "He lived on the streets near the town square. Everyone thought he was just another homeless man, but he knew a lot of things. He had books, you know, even living on the street. He kept everything in an old backpack. He said he was a doctor once up north, but something sad happened and he ended up here." "What sad thing?" "He never really told me. He just said he lost his entire family at once. After that, he said he couldn't live in a house anymore, that the walls suffocated him." Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. The story sounded strangely familiar. "And how did you meet him?" "About 3 years ago. I was coming back from school and saw him taking care of an injured kitten. The other boys were afraid of him, but I found it interesting the way he talked to the cat, as if he understood the language of animals. I started going there every day after school. He taught me about plants, about animals, about life." "And where is he now?" Jake's face saddened. "One day last winter he wasn't there anymore. I asked everyone, but nobody knew anything. Only Father Michael said he had seen him getting on a bus with a large backpack saying he was going back north to make peace with the ghosts of his past." Jake shrugged. "I think he really left." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Richard remained silent, absorbing the story. There was something poetic and sad about this man who had taught Jake so much and then disappeared. In a way, it reminded him of himself, someone who had lost everything and isolated himself from the world, albeit in a different manner. "And your mother, does she know you come here?" Jake lowered his eyes. "Sort of. She knows I'm helping take care of a sick dog. I just didn't tell her it's at Dr. Winter's mansion." "Why not?" "Because she'd be worried. She'd think I'm bothering you." He hesitated. "And also because she knows you, or knew you." Richard raised his eyebrows, surprised. "Your mother knows me." "How?" "She took our cat to your clinic once, a long time ago, before you closed your practice. She always says you were the best veterinarian in town, that you saved our Romeo when no one else could fix him." Something stirred in Richard's memory. Romeo, a Siamese cat with a severe intestinal obstruction. The owner was a young woman, served limited resources, but determined to save her animal. "Your mother is Lisa Sullivan." Jake's face lit up. "That's her, you remember?" "Vaguely," Richard lied. The truth was that he remembered perfectly. Lisa Sullivan had been one of his last clients before the accident. She couldn't afford the complex surgery the cat needed, and Richard ended up doing the procedure for free. At the time, Sarah was still alive and had fully supported his decision. "How is she?" "Good, works a lot. Now she's a housekeeper at the Blackwell House, you know, that yellow mansion near downtown." Jake seemed proud. "And Romeo is still at our house, old but strong." Richard smiled. At least one story with a happy ending amid so many painful memories. When they finished the snack, Jake insisted on helping to take things to the kitchen, despite Richard's protests. On the kitchen counter, the boy noticed a framed photograph that he had never seen before, partially hidden behind a vase. It was Richard, younger, next to a beautiful dark-haired woman. Both wore white lab coats and held a puppy between them. They were smiling. "Is that your wife?" asked Jake, pointing to the photo. Richard tensed. He had forgotten that photo was there. Normally he kept all photos of Sarah, but somehow this one had escaped being hidden. "Yes, Sarah." "Was she a veterinarian too?" "Yes, we worked together at the clinic." "And where is she now?" The innocent question hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. He turned, pretending to organize something in the refrigerator. "She's gone 8 years ago." "Oh." Jake was silent for a moment. Then, with the typical sincerity of children, he added, "I'm sorry. That must be very sad." "It is," was all Richard could say. Old Man Nobody used to say that when we lose someone we love, it's like a piece of us goes away with them. But that piece never really disappears. It stays preserved in the animals, in the plants, in the wind. We just need to learn to recognize it. Richard looked at the boy, surprised by the depth of that observation. Who was this Old Man Nobody who spoke like a philosopher to a child? "Old Man Nobody seems to have been a wise man," he commented, trying to keep his voice steady. "He was." Jake smiled. "He also said that we only heal others when we heal ourselves first. That's why you could heal so many animals before, because you were well inside. And now—" He stopped, as if realizing he was going too far. "Now what?" asked Richard, genuinely curious about what the boy was going to say. "Nothing." Jake looked away. "Let's check on Buddy. Today I brought some sunflower seeds for him. They help with recovery." Richard allowed the change of subject, but the boy's words kept echoing in his mind for the rest of the day, even after Jake had gone. "We only heal others when we heal ourselves first?" Was that why he, a veterinarian with decades of experience, couldn't find a solution to Buddy's illness? Because he himself was sick inside, embittered by the loss of Sarah. That night, for the first time in years, Richard took out from the bottom drawer of his study the small photo album that kept images of him with Sarah. He sat on the porch with Buddy at his feet and slowly flipped through the pages, allowing himself to relive the memories he had so avoided. There they were at their veterinary school graduation, young and full of dreams. At the clinic's grand opening, cutting the red ribbon together, on various trips, conferences, everyday moments, captured by a camera lens. In all the photos, the smiles were genuine, the eyes sparkled. Richard didn't even notice when tears began to stream down his face. Buddy, sensing his owner's emotion, stood up and rested his head on his knee, looking at him with his expressive eyes. "I should have been there, Buddy," murmured Richard, stroking the dog's ears. "If I hadn't stayed at the clinic that night, if I had gone with her." The accident that took Sarah's life happened on a rainy night. She was driving alone, returning from a veterinary emergency on a farm on the outskirts of town. Richard should have gone too, but a complicated case at the clinic prevented him. Sarah had insisted she could go alone. On the way back, her car skidded on a curve and fell down a ravine. She died instantly. Richard had never forgiven himself for not being with her that night. He abandoned the clinic, distanced himself from friends, and took refuge in the family mansion in Massachusetts, where he had lived as a recluse ever since. Only Buddy's arrival 2 years after the accident had brought some comfort to his lonely existence. Now, with the dog sick, it was as if the last link to any form of happiness was threatened. And yet a street boy had appeared out of nowhere, bringing hope and perhaps a little light to his dark life. Richard closed the photo album, wiped away the tears, and looked at Buddy. "We're going to get better, old friend, both of us." The next day, Frank was more taciturn than usual while tending to the garden. Richard observed him from the study window, noting his closed expression and the way he constantly looked at the clock, as if anxiously waiting for the moment Jake would arrive. At 3 o'clock, Mrs. Jenkins said goodbye as always, leaving the snack prepared for Richard's nephew. This time she had outdone herself, preparing a small cake decorated with colorful sprinkles. "Children love colors, Mr. Winters," she explained, with a maternal smile. "I hope your nephew likes it." When she left, Richard found himself anxiously waiting for Jake's arrival. The boy had become a constant presence in his afternoons, bringing a different energy to the silent house. 3:15, 3:30, 4 o'clock. Jake didn't show up. Richard went to the gate several times, looking at the deserted street. For the first time in years, he felt genuinely concerned about someone other than himself. "Did something happen?" asked Frank, approaching after finishing his tasks in the garden. "Jake didn't come today," replied Richard, unable to hide his concern. "Maybe that's for the best, sir." Something in Frank's tone made Richard turn to face him. "What do you mean by that?" Frank hesitated, looking uncomfortable. "Mr. Winters, I think you should know. Yesterday, after the boy left, I followed him." "You what?" Richard felt a wave of indignation. "By what right, Frank?" "By the right of someone who cares about you, Mr. Winters." Frank's tone was firm. "I've worked for your family for more than 10 years. I saw you go through difficult times after Mrs. Sarah's departure. I don't want to see you being deceived by anyone." "And what did you discover in this investigation of yours?" asked Richard with poorly disguised irony. "The boy didn't go home. He went straight to an antique shop downtown and talked with the owner for a good while. Then he entered a compounding pharmacy and came out with a package." "So what? What does that prove?" "I don't know what it proves, sir, but I found it strange. Why would a street boy frequent an antique shop? And what would he be buying at a compounding pharmacy?" Richard shook his head, annoyed. "Frank, he's not a street boy. He has a home, he has a mother, and as for the pharmacy, he was probably getting something for Buddy's treatment." "Maybe, sir. Or maybe they're using this boy to get close to you. He knows where you keep things. He knows the routine of the house." "Enough, Frank." Richard raised his voice, something he rarely did. "I don't want to hear any more insinuations about Jake. He is genuinely helping Buddy, and that's all that matters to me." Frank lowered his head, but his expression was that of someone who wasn't convinced. "As you wish, sir. I apologize if I offended you." When Frank withdrew, Richard went back into the house, feeling strangely protective of Jake. Why hadn't the boy shown up today? Had something happened? Or was Frank with his suspicions right, and did the boy have other motives for approaching him? The next day, Richard woke up early, feeling restless. Buddy seemed to sense his anxiety, following him around the house with concerned eyes. The dog, who continued to improve each day, seemed to miss Jake as much as he did. During breakfast, Richard made a decision. He couldn't simply wait, not knowing what had happened to the boy. "Mrs. Jenkins," he called when the housekeeper came to collect the breakfast dishes. "Do you know a family named Sullivan? The mother is Lisa, works as a housekeeper at the Blackwell house." Mrs. Jenkins thought for a moment. "Lisa Sullivan. Yes, I know her by sight. A hard-working woman raising her son alone. The boy must be about 11, 12 years old. Jake, if I'm not mistaken." "Do you know where they live?" "In St. Joseph's Village, I think, near the public school." She looked at Richard with curiosity. "May I ask why you want to know?" "It's a professional matter, from the time of the clinic." Mrs. Jenkins nodded, although her look indicated she wasn't entirely convinced. After Mrs. Jenkins and Frank left for lunch, Richard did something he hadn't done in years. He took the keys to his car, kept in the mansion's garage, and went out. Buddy, now with enough energy for a small outing, went with him. St. Joseph's Village was about 15 minutes by car from the mansion. It was a simple but organized housing complex, with small, colorful houses and well-maintained gardens, despite the evident simplicity. Richard parked near the school and began asking people about the Sullivan family. It was surprisingly easy. Everyone seemed to know Lisa and her son Jake. A lady selling lemonade at a stand in the square gave him the exact address. "The blue house with a jasmine bush in front, number 47, you can't miss it." Richard thanked her and headed there, with Buddy faithfully following him. When he reached the indicated house, he hesitated. What would he say to Lisa? How would he explain his presence there? Before he could make a decision, the door of the house opened and a woman rushed out wearing a housekeeper's uniform. Richard recognized her immediately. Lisa Sullivan, a few years older than he remembered, but with the same determined look. She saw him and stopped, surprised. "Dr. Winters, Mrs. Sullivan." Richard slightly inclined his head in greeting. "Sorry. To show up like this without warning." Lisa looked at him, then at Buddy, and an expression of understanding crossed her face. "You're the man with the sick dog." "Yes, Jake has been taking care of my Buddy, but he didn't show up yesterday, and I was worried." Lisa's countenance softened. "He's sick. High fever since yesterday. He didn't want to go to the doctor, saying it's just a cold, but I'm worried." "Can I see him?" asked Richard, surprising himself with the urgency in his voice. Lisa hesitated. "Only for an instant. Of course, he'll be happy. He doesn't stop talking about your dog and you." She looked at her watch, concerned. "But I have to go to work. I'm already late. Go ahead, I can stay with him for a while if you don't mind. Maybe even take him to a doctor if necessary." The offer surprised Lisa, but after a moment of reflection, she nodded. "All right. I've already left fever medication on the bedside table. If he gets worse, the health clinic's phone number is written on the refrigerator." She hesitated. "Are you sure it's not a bother?" "Absolutely." Richard offered a slight smile, something he didn't do often. "Your son has been very important for Buddy's recovery. It's the least I can do." Lisa smiled back, grateful, and after a few quick instructions on where to find things in the house, she left for work, but not before giving a kiss on the forehead of her sleeping son. The Sullivan home was small but impeccably clean and organized. Jake's room was simple: a bed, a shelf with some worn books and obviously used toys, and a table where various pots with plants, stones, and other objects were arranged, reminding Richard of a small improvised laboratory. Jake slept restlessly, his face flushed with fever. Buddy, upon seeing the boy, ran to the bed and put his paws on the edge, whimpering softly. "Easy, old friend. He's just sleeping," murmured Richard, stroking the dog's head. Richard sat in the chair beside the bed and observed the boy. How had someone he barely knew become so important in such a short time? There was something about Jake that touched a part of himself that Richard thought had been dead for a long time. After about an hour, Jake began to wake up. His eyes opened slowly, focusing first on Buddy, who was still beside the bed, and then on Richard. "Mr. Richard?" His voice was hoarse, weak. "What are you doing here?" "You didn't show up yesterday. I was worried." A weak smile illuminated the boy's face. "You came looking for me?" "Of course, Buddy missed you." "Just Buddy?" Jake teased with a gleam in his feverish eyes. Richard smiled. "Maybe I did too. A little." Jake tried to sit up, but Richard gently prevented him. "Stay lying down. Your mother says you have a fever." "It's just a cold." Jake coughed. "Tomorrow I'll be good to go back to taking care of Buddy. Don't worry about that now. The important thing is for you to get better." Richard placed his hand on the boy's forehead. It was hot. "Have you taken the medicine your mother left?" Jake made a face. "That syrup tastes horrible. I prefer bone-set tea with honey." "Well, who's the doctor here?" joked Richard, reaching for the medicine bottle. "Sometimes we need a little conventional medicine too, don't you think?" Jake reluctantly accepted the medicine, then smiled upon seeing Buddy, who seemed anxious to climb onto the bed. "Buddy's much better. His coat is shining again, and he's stronger. Thanks to you." Richard allowed Buddy to climb onto the bed, which made the dog immediately snuggle up beside Jake. "He missed you." "I missed him too." Jake stroked the dog, who returned the affection by licking his hand. "Can you stay for a while?" "Of course. I have no commitments." The boy seemed to think for a moment, then pointed to the shelf. "There's a book there. The blue one. Can you get it?" Richard reached for the indicated book, a worn copy of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. "Isn't this book a bit advanced for you?" he asked, surprised by the choice. "Old man nobody gave it to me. Said I'd understand it better when I grew up, but that the story of the dog would teach me a lot about the soul of animals." Richard flipped through the book carefully. There were pencil markings and notes in the margins, in an elegant handwriting that didn't seem like a child's. "Would you like me to read to you?" Jake's face lit up. "Could you? No one has ever read to me before. Only old man nobody sometimes." The request, so simple and innocent, touched Richard deeply. He settled better in the chair and began to read, in a low voice while Jake and Buddy listened to him, both equally attentive. For hours Richard remained there, reading, talking with Jake when he was willing, checking his temperature from time to time. The boy alternated between moments of animated conversation and short naps, always with Buddy faithfully by his side. In one of these moments of lucidity, Jake asked, with a voice still weak from fever, "Mr. Richard, why did you stop being a veterinarian?" The question, so direct, caught Richard by surprise. Normally, he would deflect or give an evasive answer, but something in the situation, perhaps the intimacy of the moment, or the boy's vulnerability, or perhaps the fact of being in the Sullivans' simple home, away from the protection of his isolated mansion, made him respond honestly. "My wife, Sarah, she had an accident, a car accident. I should have been with her that night, but I stayed at the clinic handling an urgent case." His voice faltered. "After that, I didn't see meaning in anything anymore." Jake listened in silence, his eyes fixed on Richard. "Old man, nobody used to say that the pain of losing someone is like a river. We can't stop the river, but we can learn to swim in it." Richard looked at the boy, impressed with the wisdom of those words. Old man nobody seemed to be someone very special. "He was," Jake hesitated. "You know what else he used to say? That the best way to honor those we love is by living the way they would want to see us live." The words hit Richard like a revelation. He had never thought of it that way. What would Sarah want to see? Certainly not him isolated, bitter, wasting his talent and knowledge. Before he could respond, they heard the front door open. Lisa had returned from work. "Jake?" she called, and soon after appeared in the doorway. "Dr. Winters, you're still here?" "I lost track of time," admitted Richard, standing up. "Your son is excellent company." Lisa smiled, visibly relieved to see that her son seemed better. "Did he give you trouble?" "None, and the fever has gone down a bit." "Thank you for staying with him. I don't know how to thank you. No need to thank me. In fact, I owe gratitude to your son. He's been doing wonders with my dog." Lisa looked at Buddy, who was still comfortably settled on the bed next to Jake. "He's always had that gift with animals, since he was little." Richard observed mother and son for a moment. There was an evident bond between them, a connection that reminded him of his own family before everything fell apart. "Mrs. Sullivan, I would like to make a proposal." Richard spoke before he could lose courage. "Your son has a natural talent for caring for animals. I've been thinking about reopening my veterinary clinic, and I'd like him to help me after school, of course. He would be an apprentice with a small remuneration." Lisa looked at him surprised. "Reopen your clinic?" "But say it's something I've been considering." It was a half-truth. The idea had arisen at that very moment, but as he spoke, Richard realized it was exactly what he wanted to do. "Jake made me remember why I loved being a veterinarian." Jake's face lit up with a joy that not even the fever could overshadow. "Seriously, Mr. Richard, I could work with you, take care of animals." "Only if your mother allows, of course." Richard looked at Lisa, who seemed moved. "And only after you've fully recovered." "Mom, please," begged Jake, trying to sit up in bed. Lisa hesitated, but her son's enthusiasm was contagious. "We would need to discuss the hours. He has school, homework." Of course, we can adjust everything according to his routine. Education comes first." Lisa looked at her son, then at Richard, and finally nodded. "In that case, I think we can talk about it when he's better." Jake's smile was worth more than any word of thanks. When Richard finally said goodbye, it was already night. He promised to return the next day to see how Jake was doing, and the boy made him promise to bring more stories to read. On the way back home, with Buddy sleeping in the passenger seat, Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. a small flame that was beginning to light again in his chest. The best way to honor those we love is by living the way they would want to see us live. Jake's words, or were they from the mysterious old man nobody, echoed in his mind. Sarah loved the clinic as much as he did. She always said there was nothing more rewarding than seeing a sick animal recover its health and joy thanks to their care. Perhaps it was time to honor her in the right way. In the days that followed, while Jake recovered, Richard began to visit him daily. He brought books, games, and always Buddy, who had become a cherished visitor in the Sullivan home. The dog was practically recovered, full of energy and with a coat shinier than ever. During these visits, Richard also spoke at length with Lisa about his plans to reopen the clinic. Jake's enthusiasm for the idea was contagious, and he spent hours drawing how he imagined the clinic would be, with special spaces for each type of animal. "This can be the cat corner," he explained, showing one of his drawings. "They need to be separated from the dogs, or they get stressed." Richard smiled, impressed with the boy's intuition. On the 5th day after his first visit to the Sullivan home, while returning to his mansion, Richard decided to stop in the town centre. There was a property that had been closed for years, which had previously housed his clinic. He hadn't passed in front of the place since Sarah's accident. The building was somewhat deteriorated by time, with peeling paint and a dust-covered "For Rent" sign in the window. But the structure seemed solid, and something about the place still emanated good memories, despite the associated pain. Richard took a deep breath and made a call. When Jake finally fully recovered, about a week later, Richard invited him for a special outing along with his mother. "Where are we going?" asked the boy, excited to enter Richard's car. "It's a surprise." They drove to the town centre. When Richard parked in front of the old building of his clinic, Jake looked curiously. "What is this place?" "It was my veterinary clinic and—" Richard smiled. "It will be again." Lisa looked at him, surprised. "You're really going to reopen?" "Yes, I've already spoken with the owner. I'll rent it again and renovations begin next week." He took a set of keys from his pocket. "Want to see it?" The interior of the building was dusty and empty, but Richard could visualize how it was before. The welcoming reception, the equipped examination rooms, the small surgery room in the back. And for the first time in years, these memories brought not just pain, but also a sense of renewed purpose. "It's going to be amazing, Mr. Richard," exclaimed Jake, running from one room to another. "Can we have an area just for rescued puppies, like those that Buddy found?" Richard frowned, confused. "What puppies?" Jake stopped, suddenly looking embarrassed. "Oh, I shouldn't have mentioned that yet." "Jake, what are you talking about?" asked Lisa, intrigued. The boy hesitated, then decided to tell. "Remember when I said I went to the antique shop and the compounding pharmacy? I was trying to find special things for Buddy. Mr. Milton from the antique shop has an old book about medicinal herbs, the kind they don't sell anymore. And the pharmacy was to buy a natural remedy that old man nobody taught me to make." "And what does this have to do with puppies?" asked Richard. I found abandoned puppies near the river last week. I was taking care of them in secret, in old Mr. Johnson's shed, who let me use it. But now that you're going to have the clinic again, I thought that—" Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like, and especially, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Richard looked at the boy, finally understanding. "You want me to take care of these puppies at the clinic? Not just take care of them." Jake looked at the floor, then raised his eyes with determination. "We could have a space for abandoned animals to find good homes for them. Old man nobody used to say that every animal deserves a family that loves them." Richard felt a strong emotion take hold of him. It was exactly the kind of project that Sarah had always dreamed of implementing, a space within the clinic dedicated to rescued animals for treatment and subsequent adoption. "You know something, Jake? I think that's an excellent idea." He looked around, pointing to a large area in the back. "We could use this space here. It would have to be something simple at first, but over time—" Jake's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Really? Can we really?" "Yes, we can, and you'll help me organize everything." Lisa observed the interaction between her son and Richard with an emotional smile. It was as if both had found something they had been looking for a long time without even knowing it. In the weeks that followed, the transformation was remarkable, not just in the clinic building, which underwent a complete renovation, but especially in Richard. The somber, reclusive man gave way day by day to someone more like the veterinarian, passionate about his craft that he once was. Frank, who had initially shown skepticism about Jake's approach, ended up becoming an ally. After witnessing the boy's dedication during Buddy's illness and seeing the positive change in his boss, he offered to help with the clinic renovation, working on weekends to build kennels and cat areas in the space that would be dedicated to rescued animals. "You're different, Mr. Winters," commented Frank as they painted one of the walls of the future adoption area together. "You seem more alive." Richard smiled, aware of the change. "I think I was just existing, Frank. Not really living." The clinic's grand opening was set for a sunny Saturday in spring, 3 months after the first meeting between Richard and Jake. The building now displayed a renovated facade with a discreet but elegant sign, Hope Veterinary Clinic. It had been Jake's idea to add hope to the name. "Because that's what Buddy gave me when he was sick, and that's what you gave me when you believed in me," the boy had explained with a wisdom beyond his years. The day before the opening, Richard made a special visit to the cemetery where Sarah was buried. He hadn't been there in years but felt it was necessary, as a kind of closure and at the same time a new beginning. The headstone was clean and well maintained, with fresh flowers that Richard knew had been placed by friends or family, who, unlike him, had not abandoned that ritual of care and memory. "Hi, Sarah," he said, sitting next to the grave. "Sorry, I haven't come before. I couldn't." The silence of the cemetery was broken only by the occasional singing of birds in nearby trees. "I think you would be proud. The clinic reopens tomorrow. It won't be the same without you, of course, but—" His voice faltered. "I think I finally understood what you always said about our work, not being just about healing animals, but about healing people through animals." He told about Buddy, about how the dog had fallen ill and how an unexpected boy had entered their lives, bringing not only healing for the animal, but also for himself. "You would have loved Jake, Sarah. He has that same intuition you had with animals, that connection that goes beyond science." Richard smiled at the memory. "You know what he told me once? That the best way to honor those we love is by living the way they would want to see us live, so that's what I'm trying to do now." Before leaving, Richard left a small bouquet of wildflowers, Sarah's favorites, and a silent promise not to let so many years pass until his next visit. The day of the opening arrived with a cloudless blue sky, like a good omen. Richard had planned something simple, just a small ceremony with the new employees, 2 young veterinarians he had hired to help him, some special guests and, of course, Jake and Lisa. But to his surprise, when he arrived at the clinic an hour before the scheduled time, there was a small crowd waiting. Former clients, professional colleagues, friends he hadn't seen in years. "How did you all know?" he asked a former college colleague. "The kid." The man smiled. "He went door to door telling all your former clients that Dr. Winters was back. Said no one took care of animals like you." Richard looked for Jake and found him in the center of a small group of children, proudly showing the dogs and cats that occupied the adoption area. The same puppies he had rescued weeks before, now healthy and playful. The opening ceremony was simple but moving. Richard gave a brief speech, thanking everyone for their presence and explaining the renewed mission of the clinic, which now included not only medical care, but also the rescue and adoption of abandoned animals. "This project would not be possible without the vision and heart of a very special person," he said, gesturing for Jake to approach. "Jake Sullivan, who will soon be our official apprentice as soon as he turns 13. Jake climbed onto the small, improvised platform, red with shyness but undeniably proud. Beside him, Buddy, with a special bow tie for the occasion, seemed equally proud. "I just wanted to thank Mr. Richard for believing in me," said the boy with a voice trembling with emotion, "and to say that every animal deserves a chance, just like every person." The simplicity and sincerity of those words provoked emotional applause from those present. After the speech, Richard cut the inaugural ribbon and the doors of Hope Veterinary Clinic were officially opened to the public. To his surprise, several of those present already brought animals for consultation or came to meet the pets available for adoption. Mrs. Jenkins, who had been specially invited, appeared with a huge basket of treats for the reception and couldn't hide her pride at seeing her boss finally resuming his vocation. "You're shining today, Dr. Winters," she commented with teary eyes. "Mrs. Sarah would be so happy. I know, Mrs. Jenkins, I know." At the end of that day, exhausted but completely fulfilled, Richard closed the doors of the clinic after the last client. The day had been a success beyond expectations. 3 animals were adopted, dozens of consultations were performed, and the schedule for the following week was almost full. Jake, who had stayed all day helping where he could, was equally exhausted, but his smile hadn't diminished a bit. "Mr. Richard, we did it," he exclaimed, throwing himself into one of the reception chairs. "Yes, we did." Richard sat down beside him. "And this is just the beginning." Lisa, who had also helped throughout the day, joined them. "You make a great team," she observed with an affectionate smile. "The best," agreed Richard. Then, in a sudden decision, he added, "Lisa, I was thinking, the clinic will need someone to take care of reception, scheduling, those administrative things. It would be a job during business hours, Monday to Friday, with a better salary than—" "Are you offering me a job, Dr. Winters?" Lisa interrupted, surprised. "Yes, and please call me Richard." Lisa looked at her son, then back at Richard. I'll think about it. It's a tempting offer." "Mom, it would be perfect," exclaimed Jake. "We could come together in the morning and I would come straight from school in the afternoon." Richard smiled at the boy's enthusiasm. "Think carefully, Lisa. The offer stands." That night, returning to the mansion with Buddy, Richard felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. The house that once seemed like a mausoleum of painful memories now began to gain a new energy. As he sat on the porch with a cup of tea, observing the stars, he allowed himself to dream about the future, for the first time in a long time. The clinic thriving, the animal rescue project growing, Jake developing at his side, perhaps even following in his footsteps as a veterinarian one day. Buddy, lying beside him, raised his head and looked at Richard as if he could read his thoughts. "You were right to be sick, old friend," murmured Richard, stroking the dog's head. "Perhaps you needed to fall ill so that I could relearn how to live." In the weeks and months that followed, Hope Veterinary Clinic became a success in the town. Richard's reputation as an exceptional veterinarian, combined with Jake's charm and dedication, who had become a sort of mascot of the place, attracted clients from all over the region. Lisa accepted the job at reception, and with her efficiency and charisma, soon became indispensable. Frank, impressed with his boss's transformation, also began to help occasionally on weekends, especially in the adoption area, where he discovered a talent for photographing animals in a way that highlighted their personality and increased their chances of finding a home. 1 year after the opening, the clinic had already expanded, also occupying the property next door to accommodate the growing rescue and adoption area. More than 200 animals had found loving homes thanks to the project initiated by Jake, who was now officially Richard's apprentice, receiving formal training after school and on weekends. On a quiet autumn afternoon, while they organized together the records of the newly rescued animals, Jake, now 13 years old and a few inches taller, asked, "Mr. Richard, have you ever regretted it?" "Regretted what?" "Letting me in that day, believing that I could save Buddy." Richard looked at the boy, surprised by the question. "Never, not for a second. Why?" Jake shrugged, suddenly shy. "Sometimes I think it was just luck. If you hadn't opened that gate—" "It wasn't luck, Jake." Richard placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. "I think it was exactly what was supposed to happen. You saved Buddy, that's true, but you saved much more than him." The boy smiled, understanding what Richard meant. That same night, after business hours, Richard received an unexpected visit at the clinic. An elderly man with white hair and stubble, but with incredibly lively and penetrating eyes. "Can I help you?" asked Richard, as he was closing the doors. "I just stopped by to see how things are going," replied the man with an enigmatic smile. "The clinic looks beautiful, and the boy seems to be doing well." Richard frowned, confused. "You know Jake?" "I do. A special kid. Has a natural gift with animals." The man looked around appreciatively. "I see you've expanded the adoption area. It was his idea, wasn't it?" "Yes, but who are you?" The man smiled again. "Some called me old man nobody, but that doesn't matter now." He extended his hand. "I'm glad you found your way back, Dr. Winters, and even happier that you helped Jake find his." Richard shook the man's hand, feeling a strange familiarity, as if somehow he had known him for a long time. "You're the man who taught Jake about animals? The one who lived on the streets?" "I taught him a few things, but he already had the essentials within him, just like you." The man began to move away. "Sometimes we just need a reminder." "Wait," called Richard. "Jake will want to see you. He talks about you all the time." The man stopped and looked back with a serene smile. "Tell him I'm proud, and that I'll keep watching even from afar." Before Richard could say anything else, the man had already disappeared around the corner. He thought about following him, but something held him back, an inexplicable certainty that that brief encounter was exactly as it should be. The next morning, when he told Jake about the visit, the boy was silent for a long moment. "I knew he hadn't really gone," he finally said, with eyes shining with emotion. "He always said he would come back when the time was right. Who is he really, Jake?" The boy shrugged, a gesture that reminded Richard of the mysterious visitor. "Old man nobody is. Old man nobody." He smiled. "He appears when we need him, and leaves when we learn to walk on our own." The explanation, though vague, made a strange sense to Richard. In a world where science and logic predominated in his veterinarian's mind, there was something comforting about accepting that some mysteries simply didn't need to be unraveled. In the years that followed, the partnership between Richard and Jake only strengthened. The boy grew up and, as predicted, followed in his mentor's footsteps, graduating in veterinary medicine with honors. Hope Veterinary Clinic became a reference in the region, not only for excellent medical services, but especially for pioneering work with rescued animals. Buddy, the Jack Russell Terrier, who had inadvertently united two very different lives, lived to the venerable age of 16, always beside his owner and his young savior. And when he finally fell asleep forever, he did so peacefully, having fulfilled his most important mission, teaching a lonely man that the heart, even when broken, can still love again. On a special afternoon, when Jake, now Dr. Jake Sullivan, was officially introduced as a partner in the clinic, Richard made a brief speech that perfectly summarized the journey of both. 10 years ago, a boy knocked on my door saying he knew how to save my dog. What I didn't know was that he would also save me. Sometimes the healing we seek comes from the most unexpected places, and the greatest teachers can be those who still have much to learn. Jake taught me that life, like medicine, is not just about science, but also about faith, intuition, and above all, love. At that moment, as he watched the crowd applaud and Jake's emotional expression, Richard felt a familiar presence beside him. For an instant, he could swear he saw Sarah smiling at him, proud. And, further back, almost imperceptible among the guests, the serene figure of a white-haired gentleman who slightly raised his hand in a gesture of approval before disappearing again. Some would say it was just his imagination, but Richard, who had learned to value both the visible and the invisible, knew that there were certain truths that transcended rational understanding. And that was perhaps the most valuable lesson that Jake and the mysterious old man nobody had taught him. The end. Now it's your turn. What did you think of this story of overcoming and new beginnings? Did Richard make the right choice by opening his heart again? We'd love to know your opinion in the comments. Don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next exciting stories.